Hey guys, tonight we are spending our time in ancient Sparta, where women ran their households with the calm authority of people who had absolutely nothing left to prove, where one queen spoke to the most powerful men in the ancient world and did not lower her voice once, where the daily life of a Spartan woman was both more free and more brutal than almost anything the rest of Greece could imagine, and where the entire glittering image of Spartan female liberation was quietly built on the backs of people who had no say in any of it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You are 7 years old and you already know this is not going to be easy. Not because anyone has told you so directly, not in those words, not with that kind of gentleness. You know it because your body has already started to understand what is expected of it, and your body has opinions about this that it has not been asked to share. The morning begins before the sun has finished deciding whether to come up. You are on your feet, barefoot on stone, the cold working its way up through your soles and into your ankles and shins like it has a schedule to keep. Around you, the other girls are already moving, already stretching, already falling into the routines that have been running long before any of you were born. There is no slow start here. There is no warm-up period in the emotional sense of the phrase. Sparta does not do warm-up periods. Sparta does beginning, and then it does continuing, and somewhere much later it does stopping, but only when it decides the stopping is warranted. You run. Not a casual jog, not a comfortable pace that lets you think about other things. You run the way Sparta expects you to run, which is hard and fast and without complaint, because complaint is not a Spartan category of response to difficulty. Difficulty is just the morning. It is just Tuesday. It is just the condition of being alive in this city, and the faster you understand that, the easier everything gets, relatively speaking. Your feet hit the packed earth of the running track, and the shock of it travels up through your legs, and your lungs begin to register the effort with the quiet alarm of something that did not expect this much to happen before breakfast. You keep going. The other girls keep going beside you. There is no finishing before everyone finishes. There is no slowing down while others are still moving. The group is the unit, and the unit keeps pace, and if you fall behind the unit does not stop. The unit just becomes something you are not part of anymore. Sparta had a word for the training system that shaped its citizens from childhood: the agoge. It is a word that comes from a verb meaning to lead or to bring up, which is either poetic or deeply ironic depending on how you feel about the methods involved. For boys, the agoge was total. They were taken from their families at age 7 and placed into a system of controlled hardship that would occupy the next 2 decades of their lives. For girls, the training was not identical. Girls stayed with their families, at least in the physical sense of sleeping under the same roof, but the expectation was the same. The body was to be trained. The body was to be capable. The body was not a decorative object. It was a civic resource, and Sparta had plans for it. So here you are, 7 years old, running in the cold, and the fact that you are a girl changes almost nothing about the immediate physical reality of this moment. Your lungs still burn. Your feet still complain. Your legs still carry you forward whether they want to or not. After the running comes the wrestling. This is the part of your morning that you're still not entirely comfortable with, not because you dislike it, but because it surprises you every time with how much it hurts, in ways that are slightly different from the ways the running hurts. Running is a long, sustained kind of suffering. Wrestling is a series of very specific, very personal kinds of suffering that arrive without warning and come from other people. You square off with another girl roughly your size. She looks exactly as tired as you feel, which is at least something you share. There is a moment of stillness before the contact, a breath, and then you are both moving, grabbing, shifting weight, trying to find the angle that will take the other person to the ground before they find the angle that will take you there instead. The instructor watches, not with alarm, not with concern, but with the calm, critical attention of someone assessing whether you are doing this correctly, which is entirely different from watching to make sure you are safe. Safety is not the primary consideration. Capability is the primary consideration. These are different things. You go down, hard. The ground does not soften its response to your arrival. You get up. The instructor says nothing, which means you did it adequately, because if you had done it wrong, there would be words about it. You file this information away and try again. Sparta's decision to train its women physically was not accidental, and it was not progressive in the sense the modern world might want to use that word. It was strategic. The Spartan state had one overriding concern, which was the production of capable soldiers, and it had worked out correctly that capable soldiers come from capable mothers. A woman who was strong, healthy, and physically trained would, in theory, produce children who were strong, healthy, and capable of being trained. The logic was entirely utilitarian. Your body was being built not for your benefit, but for the city's. The difference between that and freedom is a very important thing to sit with, and Sparta did not often sit with it, because Sparta preferred not to sit with things when there was running to be done. But here is what the training actually gave you, whether the city intended it that way or not. It gave you competence. It gave you a physical confidence that most women in the ancient world simply did not have, because most women in the ancient world were not given access to the thing that builds physical confidence, which is the regular experience of your body doing something hard and surviving it. You run, you wrestle, you throw the javelin on some mornings, the discus on others. You compete in festivals publicly in front of the whole city, and this is not considered unusual or improper. It is considered civic participation. Your body moving in public is not a scandal. It is a demonstration of Spartan values made visible and kinetic. In Athens, women were expected to stay inside. In Sparta, women were expected to be outside doing things. These are very different expectations, and while neither of them asked the woman what she wanted, one of them at least gave her the open air and the use of her own muscles, which is something. You are 11 now, and the mornings have gotten longer without getting easier, which is both the point and the shape of this life. The cold is still there, still climbing up through your feet every single morning as if it has never tried this before, and is very interested in how it goes. You are more used to it than you were. Not comfortable with it, used to it. These are different things, and Sparta is very good at teaching you the difference between the two without ever using those words. The girls around you have sorted themselves in the way that groups of humans always sort themselves, even in systems designed to prevent individuality. There are the ones who are faster. There are the ones who are stronger. There are the ones who are better at the wrestling and worse at the running, or better at endurance and worse at the quick explosive effort. You are somewhere in the middle of all of it, which is its own kind of position to occupy. Not the one the instructors watch with particular attention, not the one anyone is worried about, just present, just continuing, just moving through the days in the way the system asks you to move through them. The music lessons are something nobody outside Sparta expects when they think about this education. You learn to sing, you learn to dance, not performatively, not in a way designed to attract admiration, but in a way designed to be part of a chorus, to move with others, to hold your part while the whole group holds its shape. The religious festivals require this, and Sparta requires the festivals, and so the singing and dancing are as obligatory as the running and wrestling, which means your body is being trained in multiple directions simultaneously. Strength, speed, rhythm, coordination. The city is building something specific out of you, and it has very clear ideas about what that something should look like when it is finished. You hear things, as you get older, about what it means that Spartan women are educated and trained in this way. Visitors from other cities, dignitaries, traders passing through, they look at you with expressions that are somewhere between impressed and uncomfortable, which is a combination that tells you more about them than they probably intended. In Athens, a man might keep his wife so confined that she had no knowledge of public affairs whatsoever. This was considered appropriate. This was considered orderly. A Spartan woman who had spent her life running and wrestling and managing estates and arguing opinions in public was, to the Athenian eye, slightly terrifying. This pleased Spartan women as a general rule. But there is something underneath all of this that you're beginning to sense, in the way that you sense things before you have the words for them. The freedom you have is real, but it is bounded. The strength you have is real, but its purpose was decided before you were born. You run because the city needs you to be strong. You learn to reason because the city needs you to raise sons who can reason. You're given education and physical training and more public presence than almost any other woman in the Greek world, and all of it is in service of a project that is not yours. You did not design this system. You did not choose this life. You were born into it the way you were born into the cold mornings and the hard ground, and the fact that it is better than some alternatives does not make it a choice. Sparta asked its women to be extraordinary, and then it told them exactly what kind of extraordinary it had in mind. You are 14 now, and the mornings have a different quality to them. Not easier. The word easier does not really apply to Sparta as a concept, but more familiar, more inhabited, more like a language you have been speaking long enough that you no longer have to translate every word before you use it. The running is still the running, the wrestling is still the wrestling, but now there is something underneath the physical routine that was not there before, which is the beginning of understanding what all of this is for and what your life is going to look like when it takes its final shape. There is a passage in Plutarch that describes the Spartan girls in these terms: young women singing at festivals, strong and capable, exposed to public view in a way that would have been scandalous anywhere else in Greece. The boys who watched them understood that these were not decorative objects. These were their future wives, and their future wives were capable of having opinions about them out loud, in public, which meant that a young Spartan man had to be worth something that a Spartan woman with full use of her voice and body would choose to acknowledge. This is a different social arrangement from most of the ancient world. It is not equality, but it is something. The festival days are the moments when you understand most clearly what it means to exist in a body that the city has invested in. You dance in the chorus, and you feel the precision of it, the way the group moves as a single thing, and you feel your own part in that precision, the way your body knows what it is supposed to do and does it. You sing, and your voice is part of a larger voice, and the larger voice fills the space above the temple steps and goes somewhere you cannot follow with your eyes. These moments are not soft, they're rigorous, but they are also, in a way that is difficult to name, yours. Not the city's version of yours, something closer to the actual thing. You are 17, and the cold has stopped registering as cold. It is just the morning temperature, it is just the air. Your feet have made their accommodation with stone long ago, and your lungs have worked out an agreement with the effort that they did not have at 7, and your body knows what it can do now in a way that it did not know before. This knowing is not comfortable exactly, but it is useful, and in Sparta, useful is the closest thing to precious. You have opinions. You have always had opinions because Sparta did not train its women to silence themselves the way other cities did, but now the opinions have more weight, more grounding in actual understanding of how the world works. You know the land around Sparta in a way that a girl who was kept inside could not know it. You know the rhythm of seasons and military campaigns and agricultural cycles. You know how the helots work the fields and what the yield looks like in a good year and a bad year. You know what the men are doing when they are not doing this, when they are training, when they are campaigning, when they are away for months or years, and you know what that absence means for everything that needs to keep running while they are gone. Because that is the other thing Sparta has been preparing you for, and it is the thing that the outside world misses when it talks about Spartan women's freedom. The freedom was not given because Sparta believed in freedom for its own sake. The freedom was given because the men were not going to be there. Somebody had to run things, and the somebody who ran things in Sparta, when the men were at war or in their military messes or involved in the endless rituals of Spartan military life, was the woman. The woman who had spent her entire childhood being trained to have a body and a mind capable of doing exactly that. The Spartan economy and the Spartan household were, in practical terms, run by women. They managed the estates, they supervised the helot labour, they made the decisions about what was planted and what was sold and what was kept. They handled disputes and maintained order and kept the whole domestic and agricultural machine running with a steadiness that was not remarked upon because it was expected. It was built into the plan. And when you're 17, standing in the cold morning air with everything your body now knows how to do, this is the thing you are actually being prepared for, not just the running and the wrestling and the chorus, but the long sustained labour of managing a world that was designed to be managed by someone who was never going to be thanked for it. This is what it was really like. Not simply liberating and not simply oppressive and not something that fits neatly into either of those modern categories. It was a system with a purpose, and the purpose was the city, and you were one of the things the city used to keep itself running. The fact that the using required making you capable of real things meant that the capability was also real, and the capability, once you had it, was yours even if the reasons behind it were not. That is the morning. That is the first years. That is the long, cold, bruising, occasionally musical education of a girl in ancient Sparta, where the whole point was to produce someone who could do something harder, and where doing something harder was, if you were lucky, something you eventually chose for yourself. The boys across the city are having their own version of this morning, and it is considerably worse. You know this without having to witness it, because this is simply something everyone in Sparta knows, the way everyone knows the shape of the mountains and the sound the river makes and the particular quality of the winter wind as it comes down through the passes. The boys were taken at age 7 and placed into the agoj in its full institutional form, sleeping in barracks, eating in groups, regulated by older boys who had authority to enforce discipline in ways that were not gentle. You sleep in your family home. You see your mother. These are differences that matter, and you're not so foolish as to ignore them. But the training itself asks similar things of your body, and your body does not care about the philosophical distinctions. It cares about the running. It cares about the cold. It cares about the sustained and daily requirement to be more capable today than it was yesterday. The philosophy behind this is something you absorbed before you were old enough to question it, the way you absorb all foundational things, through observation and repetition, and the quiet consensus of everyone around you, agreeing that this is simply how things are. Sparta trained its girls because weak women produced weak children, and weak children were of no use to the state, and the state was the only thing that mattered in the accounting system that governed everything here. The body politic was an actual body, the bodies of its citizens, and those bodies were to be maintained at a level of capability that reflected the city's values. This logic was so thoroughly embedded in Spartan life that it did not feel like ideology. It felt like weather. It felt like gravity. It felt like the kind of obvious truth that needs no argument, because the argument has already been settled by centuries of people living as if it were true. What it produced, and this is the thing that astonished outsiders, was a population of women who were visibly different from their counterparts elsewhere in the Greek world. An Athenian woman was pale, because she spent her days inside. A Spartan woman was not pale. She moved with a physical confidence that came from long practice at using her body in demanding ways. She held herself differently. She spoke with the economy and directness that Spartan culture prized in all its citizens, an economy of language that conveyed more than twice the words would have, because every Spartan sentence was a sentence that had already removed everything that was not strictly necessary. The surplus had been trimmed away. What remained was the essential thing. Essential. You are running again. It is 3 years later and you are 10, and the track is the same track, and the cold is the same cold, and the effort is the same effort, but none of it is the same because you are different. Your lungs have made their accommodation with the demand. Your legs have found their rhythm. Your feet have arrived at a kind of peace with the ground that is not softness but is something like understanding. You still feel it. You will always feel it. But you feel it now the way you feel the weight of a tool you know how to use, as information about the task rather than as suffering that must be endured. The wrestling has evolved. You are not the same wrestler you were 3 years ago, and the girls you wrestle with are not the same opponents, because everyone has been changing. The instructor watches with the same critical attention, but the corrections are different now, less foundational, more technical. The thing that needs adjusting is no longer how you stand, but how you move from one position to another, how you read the shift in someone else's weight before they have fully committed to it, how you use your own smaller size as information rather than limitation. These are not lessons that are explicitly taught. They are lessons that the practice itself teaches, if you pay close enough attention, and you have been paying attention. There is a girl whose name is, in the approximation that will survive in the kind of memory that does not write things down, something like clarity of purpose in the body. She's faster than you. She has been faster than you since the beginning, and she will probably always be faster, and this has stopped bothering you in the way it once did, because you have worked out that being faster than someone else is not the point. The point is what you can do. The point is your own capability growing in relation to itself. The faster girl is not your competition in the sense that beating her would mean anything. She is your reference point, the visible measure of what this kind of training produces when it really works, and watching her run is sometimes what you do when you want to understand what it is possible for a body to do. The festivals arrive 3 times a year with a regularity that is both welcome and demanding. The Gymnopedia, the Hyacinthia, the Carnea, the rhythm of the Spartan religious calendar moving through the year with the same purposeful efficiency that governed everything else. The girls participate in all of them, dancing and singing and competing, doing these things in public in a way that the rest of Greece watched with a mixture of admiration and discomfort that you have long since decided is someone else's problem. At the Gymnopedia, you dance in the chorus with girls who have trained alongside you for years, and the precision of it is something that requires a different kind of attention from the running and the wrestling. This is not the attention of surviving a physical demand. This is the attention of being one part of a larger pattern, of maintaining your position in a structure that depends on every element remaining where it is supposed to be. You have to know where the girl beside you is without looking at her. You have to know where you are in the sequence without counting. You have to feel the music in the way that lets your body respond to it before your mind has finished processing the instruction. The boys are watching. This is simply a fact of the festival. The boys are there, and they are watching, and this is part of the design. You have known since you were old enough to understand what you were being told, that this public visibility was itself a civic function. You were being seen by the people who would later fight the wars that the city's existence depended upon. You were demonstrating, through the competence of your body, that you were the kind of woman who would produce the kind of men that Sparta needed. This logic runs underneath the festival like a river running under ice, present and powerful, and not discussed in those terms, but understood by everyone who has lived long enough in this city to understand how things actually work. It would be dishonest to say you feel nothing but duty in these moments. The dancing is also beautiful. The music is also compelling in a way that has nothing to do with politics or demographics, or the requirements of state policy. There is something in the communal precision of the chorus that produces a feeling you have not found words for. A sense of being both yourself and part of something larger than yourself simultaneously, without losing either. You're still you. You're still in your body, still conscious of your own effort, still aware of exactly what your feet are doing and where your arms are and whether the line is maintaining its shape. And at the same time, you're an element in something that is more interesting than any one element could be alone. This feeling is real. It is its own kind of education, the kind that cannot be transmitted through instruction, but only through practice, through doing the thing enough times that the thing starts to teach you what it is. At 13, a Spartan girl occupied a position in the social landscape that had no real parallel in the rest of the Greek world. You were old enough to be considered seriously as a future wife, young enough that the marriage was still years away, educated enough that you had real opinions about the world you were moving through, and trained enough that your body could do things that women in other cities could not. You were also, crucially, visible. In a world where the respectable woman was the invisible woman, this visibility was its own kind of power, even if it was not a power you'd been asked whether you wanted. The conversations that happened in the margins of the festivals, the quick exchanges with other girls while the instructors were occupied with something else, the slow accumulation of a shared understanding of how this city worked and what your place in it was, these were not officially part of your education. But they were education. You learned which families had influence and why. You learned which older women were respected and for what reasons. You learned the patterns of Spartan social life in the way that you learn any language, through immersion in it, through 1,000 small interactions that each added a piece to the picture until the picture was complete enough to navigate. The food deserves its own moment. Spartan food was famous in the ancient world for being bad, and the fame was earned. The Spartans ate with their military messes, or in the case of women, within a household system that prized simplicity as a civic virtue. The black broth, melasomos, was the most notorious item in the Spartan dietary tradition, a soup made from pork and blood and vinegar that was so comprehensively unpleasant that a Sybarite king, who was visiting Sparta, is supposed to have said after tasting it that he finally understood why Spartan soldiers were so willing to die. You have eaten this broth your entire life, and you no longer notice its character particularly, which is itself a kind of information about what sustained experience of something does to your perception of it. It stops being bad, it becomes normal, and normal is a thing you can survive indefinitely. The simplicity of Spartan diet was not accidental, and it was not poverty. Sparta had resources. Laconia was agricultural land of reasonable quality, and the helot labour that worked it produced surpluses that could have sustained a much more elaborate cuisine. The austerity was a choice, or rather it was a policy, which means it was a choice made by people with authority for people without authority over the matter. The argument for it was the argument Sparta made for everything it was. Simplicity produced strength, luxury produced softness, softness killed soldiers, and dead soldiers meant the end of Sparta, and the end of Sparta was the worst thing that could happen, because without Sparta there was no one to maintain the way of life that made everything else possible. The circularity of this argument was not considered a problem. The argument had been working for generations. Working arguments are not subjected to philosophical scrutiny in cities that are functionally military states. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You eat your meals and they are simple and adequate and you do not think about them very much, which is the goal. Your body is a tool. Tools require maintenance. The food is the maintenance. This framing, once you have fully inhabited it, makes the food stop being an experience and start being a function. And functions do not need to be enjoyable to serve their purpose. There are things that happen at the edges of the official training that the official training does not discuss. Friendships that develop their own grammar, their own private references, their own way of communicating, that does not require the compressed Spartan syntax because you are not in public and you are not performing citizenship at this particular moment. You are just girls, which is something you get to be in the spaces between the demands, and those spaces are small, but they are real. There is a girl who knows everything about birds. She can identify any bird in the Eurotas Valley by its sound alone, and she has tried, with mixed success, to teach this skill to everyone around her, and the trying is funny in a way that nothing in the official training is funny, because the official training is not really designed around the category of funny. Funny is something that happens in the margins, and the margins are where you find the parts of yourself that the city did not design. At 15, you are becoming something recognizable, not finished, not complete, because the training does not end and capability does not cap, but the shape of the adult you're going to be is becoming visible in the way a landscape becomes visible as the light improves. You are strong. You know you are strong because you have tested the strength against real demands and it has met them. You are capable of endurance. You know this the same way. You have opinions that are formed from actual knowledge of actual things, and you are capable of expressing those opinions with the directness that Sparta prized, and you know when to speak and when to hold the speech back and let someone else's mistake make the argument for you. You're also beginning to understand the limits of what all of this gives you. The capability is real, but its purpose was decided before you were born. The freedom is real, but it is freedom to do the things that the city needs you to do. These are genuine freedoms in the comparative sense. Compared to an Athenian woman, confined to the interior of her husband's house, permitted to appear in public only on certain religious occasions, educated in the skills of domestic production and nothing else, you are extraordinarily free. This comparison is real and it matters, but the fact that the cage is larger than other cages does not mean there is no cage. You will marry when the city and your family determine that you should marry, at an age that is considered appropriate for producing the maximum number of healthy children over the maximum reproductive period. You will manage a household that is not entirely yours in the sense that it was designed for purposes you did not choose. You will raise children whose primary obligation is to the state rather than to you, and you will participate in the raising in the knowledge that the state's claim on them is prior to yours. This is the shape of the life that has been prepared for you by the training that has been preparing your body since you were old enough to run. The marriage customs of Sparta were, to put it gently, unusual enough that even the Greeks of other cities found them worth remarking on. The ceremony itself was not elaborate. Spartan life did not do elaborate as a matter of principle, and the wedding was no exception. But the customs surrounding the early stages of marriage were genuinely peculiar, even by the standards of a peculiar people, and they reveal something important about how the Spartan state thought about marriage as a civic function, rather than as a personal arrangement between two people who had decided to build a life together. The bride's hair was cut short on the wedding night. She was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, and she lay on a rough pallet in a darkened room. The husband, who would be coming from his military mess and would be expected to return there before morning, came and went in the dark. The strangeness of this is apparent, and the interpretations of what it means have proliferated among historians in proportion to the strangeness. Some read it as a ritual transposition of gender roles, a symbolic acknowledgement of the woman's unusual position in Spartan society. Some read it as a practical arrangement designed to minimize the emotional and domestic attachment that might distract the husband from his primary obligations to his military unit. Some read it as simply the particular form that Spartan practicality took in the context of an institution that every other society in the Greek world treated with considerably more ceremony. What is clear is that the early Spartan marriage was not designed to create a domestic partnership in the way that modern, or even most ancient institutions designed marriage. The husband lived in his mess. He visited. The wife managed the household and the estate and the children because those were her domains, and the management was real and the authority was real, but the arrangement that produced it was not the warm cohabitation that other cultures associated with the married state. This was something more institutional, more deliberately engineered, more oriented toward the city's goals than toward the two people's happiness. Over time, as a couple aged and the husband aged out of the most intensive period of military obligation, the arrangement became more conventional in some practical ways. The husband might spend more time in the household. He might become more involved in estate management. The strict separation between military life and domestic life that characterized the early marriage softened as the years went on. But the foundation had been established in that early strange period, and the foundation was one in which the woman's authority over the domestic sphere was structurally guaranteed by the husband's primary obligation elsewhere. She managed because he was not there. She was good at managing because she had been trained for it and had been doing it from the beginning. The competence was built first, the arrangement confirmed it later. Children in Sparta were examined at birth. The elders of the tribe reviewed the infant and made a determination about whether the child was sufficiently healthy and well-formed to be raised. Infants who did not meet the standard were, according to the ancient sources, exposed at a place called Apothetae, which means deposits, near the foot of the Tegetos mountain. The historical reality of this practice is debated by modern scholars, some of whom note that the ancient sources have their own agendas in describing Spartan customs, and that the scale of the practice may have been overstated. What is less debated is that the principle was real. The state had an interest in the physical quality of its citizen population that it exercised from the moment of birth. For the mother, this meant something that no modern vocabulary fully captures. Your child could be taken from you before it had a chance to exist in any social sense, not because of anything you had done or failed to do, but because a group of men examining it in the cold light of post-birth assessment had determined that it did not meet the city's standard. The training that had been given to you, the capability that had been built into your body, the state's investment in making you healthy and strong specifically so that you would produce healthy and strong children, all of that could be rendered irrelevant by a decision made in those first moments. The child would be gone. You would continue. The training would have served its purpose in a negative sense, would have demonstrated that you could produce, even if this particular product had not been accepted. This is the weight that sat underneath the pride. The Spartan woman was celebrated for her strength, for her directness, for her management of the household, and her capacity for the running track, and her willingness to send her sons to war without tears. All of that was real, and underneath it was the specific vulnerability of a person whose reproductive function had been made into a civic resource, which meant that the state had opinions about the outputs of that function, and was empowered to act on those opinions in ways that the person involved could not prevent. You carry this knowledge without discussing it the way you carry most of the fundamental realities of this life, as something that is simply the condition of existing here, something that was present before you arrived and will remain after you are gone. You do not like it. Liking it is not offered as an option. You simply know it is there, and you conduct yourself with the composure that this city requires in the face of things you cannot change, and somewhere underneath the composure the knowledge sits, heavy and permanent, for as long as you are a woman capable of reproduction in this particular city. The Spartan woman's relationship to death was something that outsiders found both admirable and unsettling, which is a combination that tells you again more about the outsiders than about the Spartans. The stories are numerous, and they all follow the same shape. A mother sends her son to war. He returns having survived but having fled the battlefield. She kills him herself or disowns him, or tells him that if he had died in battle he would have been mourned, but having lived in cowardice he has made himself nothing. A mother receives news that her son has died in battle. She does not weep. She says something to the effect that she is glad, because she bore him for exactly this purpose, and he has served it. These stories are collected in a text called the Sayings of Spartan Women, preserved through Plutarch, and they are almost certainly curated for effect, selected for the most extreme examples of Spartan female composure in the face of death, because those were the examples that made the point most dramatically. They should not be taken as an accurate statistical sample of how every Spartan mother responded to the death of her child. They should be taken as evidence of what Sparta considered the appropriate emotional response, the ideal that was held up, the standard against which real responses were measured and found either adequate or inadequate. The real responses existed in the spaces between the ideal. They existed in the moment before the composure was assembled, in the brief private time between receiving the news and appearing in public to receive it properly. They existed in the training that produced the composure, the long practice of processing difficulty without displaying it, of accepting what cannot be changed by visibly accepting it. The composure was not the absence of feeling. It was the learned management of feeling, the specific Spartan form that grief and fear and love took in a culture that had decided these emotions were private matters, and their expression in public was a form of civic failure. This is the thing that the outside world could never quite see when it looked at Spartan women and noted their composure and called it admirable. The composure was earned. It was not natural. It was not the absence of what other cultures expressed. It was the specific result of living in a system that had decided you were required to be strong, and had then spent your entire life making you strong in exactly that way. And the making had been thorough enough that the strength was real, and the strength was yours, and it looked from the outside like a quality of character that Sparta had simply been fortunate enough to produce in such abundance. What it looked like from the inside is harder to know, because the inside is where Sparta kept things that it did not display. But the inside was there, the women were there, and behind the running track and the festival chorus and the laconic sayings and the famous composure in the face of death, there were simply people, living complex lives in a demanding system, managing their way through the years with the capability that the system had given them and the inner life that the system had tried without complete success to make its own. The land that contained all of this, the Eurotas Valley with its wide, flat agricultural floor and the dark mountains rising on both sides, was itself something that shaped the character of those who grew up in it. The Taygetos Range to the west is one of the most formidable mountain barriers in the Greek mainland, rising to nearly 2,400 meters, snow-covered in winter, a continuous presence in the western sky of anyone looking out from the valley floor. The Parnan Range to the east is lower but nearly as dramatic. The effect of growing up between those ranges, in a valley that the geography itself defended, was the effect of growing up in a place that felt protected and contained simultaneously, a landscape that said we are here and we are not easily reached, and that quality of the place lived in the people who grew up looking at it every day of their lives. The river, the Eurotas, runs south through the valley toward the sea, clear and cold and moving with the consistent purpose that rivers in limestone country have, fed by the mountain snowmelt and the springs that emerge from the hillsides. It is there today. You can go and look at it. The same water does not flow there, of course, water is not that kind of thing, but the same channel carries the same kind of water in the same direction past the same hills, and standing on its banks requires no particular effort of imagination to feel the connection between the place and the people who organize their entire civilization around the requirements of defending it. And yet you run, and the running is yours in a way that cannot be completely located in the city's purpose for it. Your body's relationship with its own capability is not fully owned by the state that produced the capability. When you finish a long morning and feel the specific quality of tiredness that comes from genuine effort, from using the full capacity of your body for the duration it can sustain, there is something in that feeling that is simply experience, simply being alive in this body in this morning, simply the texture of this particular life being lived. The city did not design that experience. It happened inside the design, but it is not reducible to it. This is the complicated thing about Sparta, and specifically about what it meant to be a girl growing up in it. The system used you. The training was for the state. The capability was a civic resource. All of this is true, and the capability was also real, also yours, also present in your body in a way that could not be fully requisitioned back. You could run. You were strong. You had opinions and the habit of expressing them. The city gave you these things for its own reasons. What you did with them was not entirely up to the city. You are 17, and you understand this now in the complete way, not as a philosophical proposition, but as lived knowledge. You stand at the edge of a life that will ask enormous things of you, that will require the management of complex systems under difficult conditions without recognition or reward beyond the continuity of those systems. You are ready for it. The readiness is real, and the readiness is yours however it was produced. That is what the running track gave you in the end. Not obedience, not the compliant service of a state mechanism. Something more complicated and more interesting. The experience of being capable. And capable people, once they have that experience fully in their bodies, tend to find ways to use it that the people who trained them did not entirely anticipate. There is a story about a Spartan woman and a visitor from another city. The visitor, after watching her manage some situation that would have required 3 Athenian men and a considerable amount of deliberation, remarked that Spartan women were the only women in the world who ruled men. And the woman, without breaking stride or looking particularly surprised by the observation, is supposed to have said simply that Spartan women were also the only women in the world who gave birth to men. The story is apocryphal. Most of the best Spartan stories are, but it has survived because it captures something accurate about the posture Spartan women carried through the world, the specific combination of capability, authority, and complete indifference to whether anyone else was impressed by it. Gorgo understood that posture from the inside. She was born into the royal house of Sparta, daughter of King Cleomenes I, raised in proximity to power, in a city that treated proximity to power as its primary educational resource. She does not appear in the historical record as a child in the way children usually appear, with softness, with the innocence of someone who has not yet understood the game. She appears already understanding the game, already positioned within it, already the kind of person who notices what other people are not noticing and says so. The royal household of Sparta was not isolated from the daily life of the city in the way that royal households in more hierarchical societies tended to be. Sparta's kings were not god kings or remote figures attended by layers of courtiers who insulated them from ordinary civic life. They ate in the military messes with their fellow citizens. They participated in the training alongside those citizens. They sat in the same assemblies and were subject to the same oversight from the ephors as everyone else of their class. The royal household was simply a Spartan household with more political significance, which meant that the children who grew up in it grew up in the same general social environment as other Spartan citizens' children, with the addition of more political conversation, more foreign visitors, more exposure to the decisions that shaped the city's relationship with the wider Greek world. For Gorgo, this meant growing up in a household where the business of power was conducted in her presence, where diplomats and ambassadors and military commanders arrived and had conversations that were not hidden from the children of the house, where the education that came from simply being in the room while serious things were discussed was continuous and comprehensive. She was educated as Spartan girls were educated, which meant the running and the wrestling and the chorus and the physical and intellectual formation that the city required of its female citizens. But she was educated in addition by the particular environment of the royal household, by the specific access to political reality that proximity to a Spartan king provided. The result was the child who appears in Herodotus, already analytical, already capable of cutting through the elaborate presentation of a skilled diplomat to the geographical reality underneath it, already in possession of the kind of practical intelligence that says the distance is too great before the speaker has finished making his case for why the distance should not be a concern. She was perhaps 8 or 9 years old, if the accounts can be trusted, when she first appears in the record doing something that has been written about ever since. A man named Aristagoras arrived from the city of Miletus. He was attempting to persuade her father Cleomenes to commit Spartan military forces to a rebellion against the Persian Empire, and he was making his case with the particular intensity of a man who needed this to work. He had a map. He laid it out. He explained the distances, the rewards, the opportunities involved. Cleomenes was listening with the careful attention of someone who had not decided yet, and Gorgo, sitting nearby, said what any child in any era who has been paying attention says when adults are making decisions based on geography. She said that the distance was too great. She said it directly, clearly, without preamble or apology. She told her father that if he walked that map's distances, he would be ruined before he arrived. Cleomenes listened to his daughter. He sent Aristagoras away. The story was recorded by Herodotus, and it has been analysed and reanalysed across the centuries since, sometimes as evidence of Gorgo's exceptional intelligence, sometimes as a detail that reveals something about Spartan child-rearing, sometimes as a curiosity about the informality of Spartan court life where a child's opinion was at least audible. But what is worth sitting with is not just that she said it is that she said it in that room, in that moment, in the presence of men engaged in the serious business of military alliance, and no one in the room appears to have found it inappropriate. That is its own kind of information about the world she lived in. She was young when she married Leonidas, the man who would become one of history's most famous commanders, though at the time of their marriage he was simply the third son of a Spartan king, not yet in line for anything in particular. Spartan kingship passed in complicated ways, and the path to the throne required the absence of people who were in front of you in the succession, which is a way of saying that becoming king in Sparta often meant that a number of other people had died first. Leonidas became king. The people in front of him died. These things are connected. Gorgo became queen in a city that understood queenship very differently from most places in the Greek world. She was not expected to be ornamental. She was not expected to stay quietly inside the palace and appear at state occasions in fine clothing and say nothing of substance. She was a Spartan woman, which meant she had been trained from childhood in the things that Spartan women were trained in, and those things included having opinions about civic matters and expressing them with the directness that Sparta considered a basic courtesy. There is a moment in Herodotus that shows her in this capacity more clearly than anything else. A message arrived in Sparta, a wax-coated wooden tablet that appeared blank. The circumstances were politically delicate. Someone needed to know what was actually being communicated. The tablet was passed around among powerful men, and none of them could determine what, if anything, was hidden there. It was Gorgo who suggested scraping the wax away. Underneath the wax was a message carved into the wood beneath it, a warning about Persian military intentions sent by Demaratus, a Spartan exile who had found a way to communicate covertly when open communication would have meant his death. Because Gorgo suggested the right action, the message was recovered. Because the message was recovered, Sparta had warning. Because Sparta had warning, preparations could begin. How much weight to assign to any individual act in the long causality of historical events is always uncertain. But Herodotus included the detail, and he included Gorgo's name as the person responsible for the insight, and in an era when women's names were largely absent from military and political histories, her presence in that record is its own kind of evidence. Her marriage to Leonidas was, by the standards of the ancient world, unusually equal in some respects. Sparta's social structure meant that they did not share their daily lives in the way a modern couple would imagine sharing a life. Spartan men lived primarily in their military messes, the syssitia, where they ate and trained and maintained the bonds of military brotherhood that Sparta considered essential to its fighting strength. A Spartan husband did not sit at home every evening with his wife. He visited. He was a guest in his own household in certain practical senses. This arrangement, which would sound bizarre anywhere else in Greece, was simply Spartan, and it had a consequence that was direct and unambiguous. It meant that Gorgo ran her household, not as a supplement to Leonidas, as the primary manager of everything that was not the army. There is a practical intimacy in that kind of authority that is different from the decorative proximity of a queen who stands next to a powerful man at official functions. Gorgo made decisions about resources, about the estate, about the helots who worked the land, about everything that needed deciding when Leonidas was not there, which was most of the time. She exercised real administrative power in a domestic context, and the domestic context in ancient Sparta was not small. It was the foundation on which the military state rested. When Leonidas prepared to march to Thermopylae, there is a story, again from Plutarch, and Plutarch is always telling us stories that we cannot entirely verify, but cannot entirely dismiss either. There is a story that Gorgo asked him what she should do. His answer was that she should marry a good man and have good children. This is the kind of answer that sounds cold when you write it down, but in its Spartan context it is also a complete instruction set for what a Spartan woman's life was supposed to be, and Gorgo received it with the composure of someone who had already understood that this was always how it was going to end. He went. He did not come back. 300 men and their king died at a narrow pass in central Greece, and the pass held long enough for the rest of Greece to begin organising a response, and the response eventually worked, and the Persian invasion was repelled, and the battle became the most famous last stand in Western history. And Gorgo was in Sparta when it happened, running the household, managing the land, doing the work that the state depended on her to do, which was the work no one was going to build a monument to. What happened to Gorgo after Thermopylae is not well recorded. History tends to lose interest in women once the dramatic moments associated with their famous husbands have passed. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. She had a son, Pleistarchus, who was still a child when Leonidas died. She had her estates, her standing, her social position. She had the authority that came from being the widow of a man who had become a legend in the years immediately following his death, when the battle at Thermopylae was being transformed into the kind of story that a city tells itself about itself when it needs to believe it is capable of sacrifice. She had outlived the man, and she had outlived the moment, and she was left with what women in her position were almost always left with in the ancient world: the daily work of continuation, in a city that would go on telling itself stories about the famous dead long after it had forgotten the names of the people who kept everything running while the famous were dying. Her name survived because Herodotus kept it, because she said the right thing at the right moment in 2 occasions that he thought were worth recording. Most Spartan women did not get even that. Most Spartan women ran their households and managed their estates and raised their children and expressed their opinions with characteristic directness, and then disappeared from the record entirely, not because they did nothing, but because the record was kept by people who had decided that what they did was not the kind of thing worth writing down. Gorgo is the exception. She is the name that made it through, and that name carries with it, faintly, the suggestion of all the others that did not. The world Gorgo was born into was a world in crisis, though no one who lived in it would have used that word because crises in the ancient world tended to feel less like exceptional moments and more like simply the condition of being alive in a time when empires were moving and city-states were deciding what kind of thing they were going to be. Persia was the largest empire the world had yet seen. Its kings ruled from the Indus Valley to the Aegean coast, and that coast included Greek cities, Ionian Greeks who had been under Persian control for decades, and who were, at the moment of Gorgo's childhood, beginning to think seriously about doing something about it. The rebellion that Aristagoras was attempting to fund when he came to Sparta was the Ionian Revolt, which would begin in 499 before the Common Era and last for 5 years and ultimately fail, though not without consequences that would echo for the next 2 decades. Aristagoras was a calculating man in a desperate situation. He had been involved in a failed military expedition. He owed the Persian king for that failure, and he saw the revolt as his way out of an increasingly impossible position. He was not, therefore, a purely principled advocate for Greek freedom. He was a man trying to survive his own mistakes at considerable cost to other people. This background does not appear in Herodotus's account of his visit to Cleomenes, but it is worth holding in mind when considering what the child Gorgo was watching in that room. Cleomenes was himself a complicated figure. He was intelligent, unconventional, and viewed with suspicion by the other Spartan authorities precisely because his intelligence sometimes led him to do things that the cautious Spartan political establishment considered dangerously clever. He was the kind of king who thought ahead in ways that the system around him was not always comfortable with, and he had already made enemies among the Ephors and the other king. Into this fraught political environment, Aristagoras arrived with his maps and his arguments, and his carefully calculated appeals to Spartan interest. What Gorgo said was simple and it was correct. She assessed the distance and found it prohibitive. The walk from the Aegean coast to the Persian interior, to where Aristagoras claimed the wealth was 3 months' travel. 3 months of supplying an army, 3 months of moving through terrain that became increasingly hostile. 3 months away from Sparta and from the helot population that always had to be watched. Whatever the potential reward, the strategic reality was unfavourable, and she said so, clearly, directly, without performance or apology, at approximately 9 years old. Cleomenes sent Aristagoras away. He refused to commit Sparta to the Ionian cause. Sparta would later send a symbolic force to help burn the Persian regional capital at Sardis, a gesture that helped trigger the series of events that would eventually produce the Persian Wars. But the full commitment of Spartan military power that Aristagoras wanted, that he never got, and the record credits a child's clear-eyed geographical assessment as the moment that settled it. The years between that documented appearance and Gorgo's marriage to Leonidas are largely invisible in the historical record, which is typical of how women's lives were documented in the ancient world. The record notices them at points of political or social significance and allows the rest to disappear. What we know is that she grew up in the Spartan royal household, that she was educated as Spartan girls were educated, that she married Leonidas while he was still a younger son of the royal family rather than the heir, and that the marriage produced a son named Pleistarchus who would inherit the throne. She was probably around 18 when she married. Leonidas was probably considerably older, which was typical in ancient Sparta, where the age gap between husband and wife was often substantial. He was a trained Spartan soldier, which meant he had spent the foundational years of his life inside the agog, inside the military mess system, shaped by the particular demands that Sparta made of its male citizens. He was not, by the standards of the Greek world, a gentle or emotionally expressive person. No Spartan man who had survived the agog was, but he was competent, reliable, and he was, by the time he came to kingship, the kind of leader that the Spartan military system was specifically designed to produce. The succession that brought Leonidas to the throne was complicated. He was the third son, which meant two brothers stood between him and the kingship, and both of them died without legitimate heirs, in ways that the historical record handles with the quick dispatch of someone who has already identified the important point in the story, which is that Leonidas then became king. He married Gorgo around this time, or possibly slightly before, and she became the daughter of one Spartan king and the wife of another, which is either a remarkable coincidence or evidence that the royal family managed their own succession with attention to the available options. What Gorgo's life looked like in the years of Leonidas's kingship, before the crisis that would make him famous, is the part of the story that the history loses most completely. She was managing a royal household in a city that expected royal households to function like larger versions of every other Spartan household. She was raising their son. She was participating in the social and religious life of the city in the capacity of a Spartan queen, which meant public festivals, which meant the kind of visible civic presence that Spartan women maintained in a way that women elsewhere in Greece did not. She was almost certainly involved in the political life of the Spartan court to a degree that the surviving record does not capture, because the record was made by people who were not primarily interested in domestic political dynamics. The Spartan political system was genuinely unusual in the ancient world in several respects, and understanding it helps place Gorgo within it more precisely. Sparta had two kings simultaneously, always, from two different royal families, the Aegeads and the Eurypontids, a dual kingship that was part of the original constitutional settlement of the Spartan state. The two kings had military authority but were balanced by 5 ephors, elected annually from the citizen body, who held significant executive power and could challenge, constrain or even arrest a king who stepped beyond what the system considered appropriate. There was also the Gerousia, a council of 28 men over 60 years old plus the two kings, which handled significant deliberative functions. This system meant that being a Spartan king's wife was not the same as being the wife of a Persian king or an Egyptian pharaoh. Leonidas was powerful but constrained. His power depended on maintaining the support of the ephors and the citizen body, and that support was earned, maintained, and occasionally lost through the political relationships of Spartan civic life. Gorgo, living in this environment, would have understood the political landscape with considerable sophistication because the Spartan royal household was embedded in it and could not avoid being so. She had grown up in the royal household of Cleomenes, who was himself a politically complicated figure, a king who had manipulated oracle outcomes, who had bribed the priestess at Delphi, who had made and broken alliances with the agility of someone who understood power as a flexible tool rather than a fixed condition. Growing up in close proximity to this kind of political intelligence, watching how alliances were made and broken, how information was used and withheld, how the image of a decision could be managed independently of the decision itself, would have been an education that no formal instruction could replicate. The question of what Gorgo thought about the events building toward Thermopylae is one that the historical record cannot answer, but that history cannot quite stop itself from asking. The Persian threat was real and long building. The Greeks had known since the failure of the Ionian revolt that Persia would eventually attempt a larger invasion, and the decade after the Battle of Marathon in 490 had been a decade of preparation, political manoeuvring, and the building of coalitions among Greek cities that did not naturally cooperate. Leonidas was part of the Spartan deliberations about what to do, about how much to commit, about where to position Sparta in the larger Greek response. A Spartan king's wife was not officially part of these deliberations. She was not a member of the Gerousia. She did not vote in the assembly. The political institutions of Sparta, despite the unusual social position of Spartan women, remained formally male. But informal influence is not the same as formal exclusion, and in a system where relationships and reputation and the management of information mattered enormously, a woman who had grown up in the royal household, who had demonstrated clear political judgment since childhood, who was respected and known throughout the civic life of the city, was not without influence simply because her influence was not formally institutionalized. We cannot know what Gorgo said in the conversations that were not recorded. We cannot know whether she argued for or against the decision to send 300 men to Thermopylae. We cannot know whether she understood, before the outcome was clear, that the decision was likely to be a final one. What we know is that she was there, in the city, in the household, in the conversations that were happening around the decisions, and that she was, by every measure the record has given us, someone who paid attention. The coded tablet story places her at a moment of acute political intelligence. A message arrives that looks like nothing, a blank wax tablet, the kind used for routine correspondence. Demaratus had been a Spartan king who was deposed in circumstances that were complicated by the actions of Gorgo's father Cleomenes, and who had as a result ended up at the Persian court of Darius and then of Xerxes, which is the kind of trajectory that sounds improbable and is simply what happened to people who fell from favour in the ancient world's particularly severe way. From this position, Demaratus sent Sparta a warning. Xerxes was planning to invade Greece. The message could not be sent openly. An open message from a former Spartan king living at the Persian court to his former city would have been intercepted with speed and certainty. So he carved the warning into the wood of the tablet and covered the wood with wax. The wax surface was blank. The tablet looked like an unused writing surface. It was carried through Persian-controlled territory by people who were presumably searched, who had nothing on their person that was not supposed to be there, because the wax tablet was an ordinary object and nothing about it called for special attention. When it arrived in Sparta, the problem was not transport but decryption. Not decryption in the modern technical sense, but in the simpler sense of understanding that there was something to decrypt. The tablet looked blank. It was not obviously a coded message. The people who received it and examined it were working from the assumption that a message was present because the sender had a history with Sparta that made the receipt of a blank tablet from him surprising. But the blank tablet was convincingly blank, and the men examining it could not work out what to do with it. Gorgo suggested scraping the wax. This is such a simple suggestion, in retrospect, that it almost seems too simple to have been the key. But simplicity and correctness are not the same thing, and the simplest correct answer is still the correct answer. The wax was scraped. The message was underneath it. The warning was received. Sparta began preparing for what would become the Persian Wars, the conflict that would produce Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea, and the eventual repulsion of the Persian invasion, which changed the course of Western history in ways that are still visible in the world we inhabit. Whether Gorgo's contribution to that moment is truly significant in a causal sense, whether Sparta would not have otherwise discovered the message or obtained the warning through other means, is a question that cannot be answered. History does not come with counterfactuals built in. What we know is that Herodotus records her as the person who solved the problem, that he includes her name where he had no obligation to include anyone's name, and that the survival of her name in a historical record that was largely indifferent to the names of women tells us something about how the people who remembered the story valued what she did. The Leonidas who appears in the later historical record, the king preparing to lead his 300 to the pass at Thermopylae, is a figure already being shaped by the retrospective knowledge of what he was going to do there. The decision to send 300 Spartans rather than the full Spartan army. the choice of the 300 men who had all already fathered children so that their genetic lines would survive the likely deaths of their fathers, the famous exchanges with the Persian envoy who demanded the Spartans lay down their weapons and received the response in 2 words, "Come and take them." All of this exists in the historical record as something already epic, already shaped into legend by the time it was written down. What Gorgo thought of the decision to go is not recorded in the way that would be useful. The famous exchange between her and Leonidas, where she asked what she should do and he told her to marry a good man and have good children, is the kind of exchange that becomes famous because it captures something essential and something terrible in the same breath. It captures the Spartan worldview in its full, uncompromising form. There is no sentiment here. There is no extended farewell. There is duty stated clearly, accepted clearly by both of them, and then action. He went. She remained. The 300 men died at Thermopylae over 3 days in late summer of 480 before the Common Era, having held a narrow coastal pass against a Persian force vastly superior in numbers and eventually defeated only when a local Greek showed the Persians a path around the Spartan position. The tactical situation was beyond salvage at that point. Leonidas dismissed most of the allied troops, but kept the Spartans and a number of Thespians and Thebans, who chose or were compelled to remain. They fought until they were dead. The pass held long enough. The delay it imposed contributed to the eventual Persian defeat at Salamis later that same year. The aftermath came to Gorgo in the form of information delivered across a distance, in a city that was simultaneously processing the loss and already transforming it into the foundation of a story it would tell for centuries. She was not present at Thermopylae. She was in Sparta, as she was supposed to be, doing the things she was supposed to do, which was the same thing she would have been doing on any other day: the household, the child, the estate, the management of everything that continued regardless of what was happening at a narrow pass several days' travel to the north. The grief she carried is invisible in the record, not because it was not there, but because recording grief was not what the historical record did, particularly the grief of women, and particularly the grief of Spartan women who were expected to receive the deaths of their husbands and sons with the composure that the city considered appropriate and essential. A Spartan mother who wept at her son's death was a source of shame. A Spartan queen who publicly mourned her husband might have been viewed with something similar. The composure was not absence of feeling. The composure was the form that Spartan feeling took, the preference for containing rather than displaying, the conviction that dignity and loss was its own kind of statement about what a person was made of. What Gorgo was made of had been demonstrated already in the ways the record caught. Intelligence at 9, political acumen with the coded tablet, the steady management of a royal household through her husband's long absences, and the political turbulence of a city that was perpetually managing the threat of helot revolt and the complicated relationships with other Greek city-states. She was made of everything that Sparta had tried to build into its women, and perhaps a little more, and the little more is the part that made it into the history. After Leonidas died, she lived on. The record does not follow her there. Her son Pleistarchus was still a child and would become king in the way that Spartan succession required. She would have maintained the standing that came from being both the daughter and the widow of Spartan kings, a standing that was real regardless of how invisible the daily life behind it was. She would have continued managing things. That was what Spartan women did when the dramatic moments had passed. They continued. The continuing is the part of the story that the history does not tell, not because it did not happen, but because continuing was the ordinary thing, and history preferred the exceptional moments. But the exceptional moments are only made possible by the continuing that surrounds them. The intelligence that Gorgo displayed at 9 was the product of years of the kind of upbringing that Sparta gave its aristocratic children, years of exposure to political conversation and civic expectation, years of being in a room where things were happening and being required to pay attention. The clarity that she brought to the coded tablet was the product of a mind that had been trained to look for the simple, correct answer rather than the complicated, impressive one. Both things came from the life she was living in the spaces between the famous moments. She was a real person living a real life in a real city that placed enormous demands on everyone it called its own. The famous moments are the proof of what that life produced. The life itself is the thing we cannot fully see. And in that invisibility, she is entirely representative of the women who surrounded her. The women who ran the households and raised the children, and maintained the estates and kept the whole complicated machinery of Spartan society functioning, while the men were doing the things that got written down. The difference between Gorgo and most of them is simply that her name survived, and the survival of her name is owed finally to the intelligence she demonstrated so clearly, so publicly, in moments that a historian thought were worth recording. She was exceptional enough to be noticed, exceptional enough to be remembered. The exceptional ones are always built on the foundation of the ordinary ones who never made it into the record. And the ordinary ones were doing the same thing she was doing, just without the moments that happened to have a historian in the room. Now take a moment with that, because what comes next is a different kind of story, though it belongs to the same world, and it will ask you to inhabit it from the inside. You're in your early 20s, and you've been married for 3 years, and your husband has been gone for most of them. This is not a tragedy in Sparta. This is the arrangement. You knew it before the marriage, and you knew it before the training that preceded the marriage, and you knew it before the cold mornings and the running track and all the years of preparation that were, in retrospect, preparation for exactly this. Managing things while someone else is somewhere else doing something the city considers more important. You have managed things before, you will continue to manage things. The estate is yours to run, in the practical sense that matters, and you run it. The morning begins with an assessment. This is not a formal accounting in the written ledger sense, although some of what you do will eventually be recorded in that way. It is a walk. You walk the property with the focused attention of someone who knows what things are supposed to look like and is checking whether they look that way. The grain stores from the last harvest are holding. The olives need attention. There is a section of the lower field that drained badly in the last rains and needs to be assessed before the next planting cycle. And the helots who work that section need to be redirected toward the drainage work before anything else gets done. The helots are the part of this that requires a particular kind of attention, the kind that is always present even when it is not being discussed. They are not enslaved in the precise technical sense, but they are not free in any sense that their own lives would recognize, and they outnumber the Spartan citizen population by a substantial margin. Estimates range widely, but most scholars suggest something between 5 to 1 and 10 to 1. And this numerical reality is a fact that the Spartan state never forgot, and that every Spartan household manager, which means every Spartan woman managing an estate in a husband's extended absence, carries as a constant background awareness. You know their names, not out of sentiment, though some of what you feel about individuals among them is something adjacent to that word. You know their names because managing people requires knowing who they are, what they are capable of, where their capacities and limitations lie, what they respond to and what they resist. The ones who work well with the livestock, the ones who are faster and more reliable in the fields, the ones who have shown a disposition toward conflict with each other, which requires being managed because conflict among the helot workforce is both a practical problem and a political one. Everything here is both practical and political. That is the condition of this estate. That is the condition of this life. The woman who ran a Spartan estate was not a soft administrator. The relationship between Spartan citizens and the helot population was one of the most brutal in the ancient world, maintained through a combination of systematic terror and constant military readiness. There was an institution called the cryptire, in which young Spartan men would go out into the countryside at night, officially as a rite of passage and military training, and kill helots who were considered dangerous or too capable, or simply present in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was not unofficial. This was policy. It was a mechanism of population control and psychological domination, designed to prevent the kind of organized resistance that the Spartan state lived in perpetual fear of. You know about this. You have always known about this. It is part of the world you live in, the same world you were trained to manage from childhood. You were not asked whether you approved. No one asked. The system did not have an approval mechanism. It had a function, and you were part of the function, and the helots were part of the function in a different and much worse way, and the whole thing ran on the energy of everyone staying in their assigned position. The morning work continues. There are decisions to make about the olive oil from this year's pressing, and whether it is being stored correctly and what portions are owed in taxation, and what portions can be sold. There are decisions about the grain, about what proportion to hold back for the household, and what to send to the military messes where your husband eats when he is in Sparta, and where the city's soldiers are fed regardless of whose land produced what. The The system of mandatory contribution to the Syssitia means that your household's agricultural output is not entirely yours to control, and managing what comes in against what must go out requires a kind of ongoing arithmetic that is not written down but is continuously calculated somewhere in the part of your attention that never entirely rests. You handle a dispute in the late morning. Two of the helots working the lower fields have a grievance that has escalated past the point where they will resolve it themselves, and it has come to you because that is where such things come when they cannot be resolved otherwise. You listen. Not at length, not with the patience of someone who has unlimited time for this, but with enough attention to understand what the actual problem is beneath the stated problem, which is usually different. The stated problem is about tools or working arrangement or allocation of effort. The actual problem is almost always about standing, about whose position in this constrained and difficult life is being recognised and whose is being diminished. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You make a decision. You communicate it clearly, without equivocation, without the softening that might suggest the decision is negotiable, because a decision that looks negotiable invites negotiation, and you do not have time for negotiation. The decision is made, the decision stands. By midday, you have been moving for hours and have made decisions that most women in the ancient world would never be asked to make. Not because the decisions were beyond their capacity, but because the systems they lived in had decided their capacity was not relevant. You eat something practical, nothing elaborate. Sparta did not do elaborate, as a philosophical commitment as much as a practical one. The simplicity of Spartan food was famous enough in the ancient world that it was mocked by other Greeks who valued sophistication at the table, and you have heard all of these opinions and have not found them particularly compelling. You are not eating to be sophisticated, you are eating to continue the afternoon. The afternoon belongs to the equipment, the cloaks that need mending, the clothing for the household, the ongoing textile work that occupied a significant portion of every woman's time in the ancient world, regardless of her social position. But in Sparta, this work was different in texture from what it was in Athens, where a respectable woman was expected to spend her days inside, at her loom, producing domestic textile work as a demonstration of her virtue and her confinement. In Sparta, the textile work was real work with an economic dimension, but it was not the cage it was elsewhere. You do it as part of everything else you do. You do not do it as proof of anything. There are children. Not yours, not yet, but the children of the household, the younger relatives who are in your charge while their parents are elsewhere, or otherwise occupied by Spartan life's various demands. They watch you with the attention children give to adults who are doing things they do not yet understand. You explain some of what you are doing, not in a pedagogical way, not as a formal lesson, but in the ordinary way that knowledge passes from people who have it to people who are going to need it. You were trained, and the training was given to you by people who had it, and now you give pieces of it forward, the way this always works. Your husband sends word occasionally, not often. Spartan men in the military messes and on campaign did not write long personal letters in the modern sense, and communication across distances in the ancient world was slow and unreliable, and often expressed in the compressed practical language of people who knew that messages could be intercepted or delayed or lost. The message is that he is well. The message is that the campaign is proceeding. The message is that you should continue as you have been continuing, which is not a lack of instruction but a complete one. Continue as you have been. That is the assignment. You understand it perfectly. The evening brings the accounting in the informal sense, a review of what was accomplished, what remains, what tomorrow requires. You know where the estate stands in its seasonal cycle. You know what the next weeks will demand in terms of labour allocation, and what that means for the helot workforce and what adjustments need to be made. You make notes of a kind, not necessarily in writing, though Spartan women's literacy is a debated question in the historical record, but in the organised mental inventory of someone who runs a complex operation and cannot afford to forget the things that matter. Night comes down over the Eurotas Valley and the black mass of the Taygetos Mountains makes its familiar dark presence against the sky, and you're inside with a lamp and the quiet that follows a day of continuous effort. This quiet is not empty. It has the texture of everything that happened in it, the decisions, the assessments, the management, the work. You're tired in the specific way of someone who has been managing things all day, which is different from the tired of the running track, but is in some ways its descendant. Both are the result of your body doing what was asked of it, for the city, for the household, for the continuation of everything that needs to continue. Tomorrow the assessment begins again. The walk, the fields, the helots, the stores, the disputes, the textile work, the children, the accounting. This is the work that Sparta was actually built on, the daily invisible labour of women who were trained for capability and then deployed in the service of a military state that needed them to hold everything together, while the part of itself that carried weapons was somewhere else, doing something the poets would eventually write about. No one will write about this. No one will write about the morning walk or the dispute in the lower fields, or the careful management of the olive stores, or the children watching and learning. The poets will write about Thermopylae. The historians will write about the battles. And underneath all of that, running on its own quiet schedule, this continues, as it always has, as it always will. The estate is not a small thing to manage. This is not obvious to the outside world, which has a tendency to think of ancient domestic management as a scaled-up version of household chores, something a capable person could handle with one part of their attention while doing something else with the rest. The reality is considerably more complicated, and you have understood this for long enough now that the understanding has become the background condition of your life, rather than a specific realization you can point to and date. Laconia, the territory of Sparta, is a varied landscape. The central valley of the Eurotas River, where Sparta itself sits, is productive agricultural land. The mountains on both sides, the Taygetos to the west and the Parnon to the east, are not farmable in the conventional sense but are important for grazing and for the timber that construction and fuel require. The coastal areas to the south and east have their own productive character. An estate in Laconia is not a single type of land with a single type of management problem. It is a collection of different land types with different seasonal demands and different helot labour requirements, and the woman managing it has to hold all of these things simultaneously in her working attention. Your estate produces grain, primarily barley, because barley grows in conditions that wheat finds difficult, and Laconian conditions are not always favourable to wheat. The barley harvest is the central event of the agricultural year, the moment when everything that was planned and managed and maintained through the preceding months either succeeds or fails in a way that is immediately visible and immediately consequential. Too little rain at the wrong time and the heads are small and the yield is poor and the calculations you have been running all year about what the household needs and what goes to the military messes and what can be sold need to be recalculated from the beginning, under worse conditions. The rain comes when it comes. You cannot control it. What you can control is how much margin you have built into the system before the rain makes its decisions. You have learned to build margin, not sentimentally, not as an excess of caution, but as a practical response to a world that does not guarantee outcomes regardless of how well you prepare. You keep more in reserve than the minimum calculation suggests is necessary. You plan for the yield that is lower than expected, not the yield that is exactly as expected, because the yield that is exactly as expected is the thing you are hoping for rather than the thing you can rely on. This discipline is something you learned from the women who ran estates before you, the older women whose management patterns you observed and absorbed in the way that practical wisdom passes from one generation to the next, not through formal instruction but through the slow accumulation of watching capable people make decisions and understanding why the decisions were made. The olives are a separate accounting. Olive oil was one of the most valuable agricultural products in the ancient Greek world, and Laconian olive oil was known to be good. The harvest cycle for olives is biennial in its heavy production, which means that a full oil year and a light oil year alternate, and managing an estate's finances and supplies requires holding both years in view simultaneously. The light year is not a failure. The light year is the valley between two peaks, and it has its own management requirements, its own opportunities for the maintenance work that gets deferred when the harvest is demanding everything. You know which of the olive trees are oldest and which are youngest and which are in the middle years of their production. You know which sections of the grove drain well and which collect water at the root in ways that encourage disease. You know the particular quality of the oil from the eastern section versus the western, a difference subtle enough that you can only detect it in direct comparison but real enough to matter when you are thinking about what goes to the mess contributions and what goes to sale and what stays for household use. This kind of knowledge accumulates over years of paying attention to the same piece of land, and it is the kind of knowledge that cannot be transferred to someone who has not been paying the same attention to the same piece of land for the same number of years. It lives in you specifically. When you are gone, whoever manages this estate next will have to build their own version of it from the beginning. The livestock requires a different kind of attention from the crops. The animals are alive in a way that makes their demands immediate and non-negotiable. A sick animal cannot wait for a convenient moment. A ewe giving birth at an inconvenient hour does not become more convenient because the hour is inconvenient. The helots who work with the animals know them individually in the way that the people who care for animals always know them, with the granular attention that comes from daily proximity, and part of your management of the livestock is the management of those relationships, the assessment of which helots are genuinely skilled with animals and which are doing an adequate job and which are doing something that requires correction. Correction, in the context of helot management, is a delicate thing. Not delicate in the way that human dignity concerns make it delicate in the modern sense. Delicate in the purely practical sense that your corrections affect the efficiency of the operation, and you need the operation to be efficient. A helot who is punished in ways that produce resentment or fear rather than improve performance has not been corrected effectively. The correction has just become an additional management problem. You're not managing the helots from a position of sentiment. You're managing them because their performance is the primary variable in whether this estate produces what it needs to produce. This means that effectiveness matters more than expression of authority. The authority is understood. It does not need to be demonstrated for its own sake. This is a calculation that most Spartan women who managed estates had worked out in their own way, through their own experience. The cryptire was one instrument of control, the dramatic instrument, the one that kept the large-scale fear alive in the helot population. The daily management of individual households and estates was a different instrument, subtler, focused on the specific relationships between specific people over the specific demands of specific work. Both instruments operated simultaneously. Both were part of the system. Neither one was sufficient without the other. You're thinking about the lower field as you walk the estate today, the one that floods in heavy rain. The drainage problem has been there for as long as you have been managing this land, and it is the kind of problem that does not resolve itself, but also does not become catastrophic as long as it is managed around. You have allocated 3 helots to the drainage work this week, which means 3 fewer hands in the grain fields, which means the grain work will take an extra day, which means the timing of the field preparation for the next planting cycle shifts by that day, which means you have adjusted the schedule forward by a day in your mental calendar, and now need to think about whether that adjustment creates any downstream problem you have not yet anticipated. This is the texture of the management, not a single large decision made periodically, but a continuous stream of small adjustments, each one setting the conditions for the decisions that follow, each one requiring that you hold in view not just the current state, but the state as it will be in a week, in a month, in the season ahead. The mental load of this is substantial, and it is sustained, and it is performed without external acknowledgement, because external acknowledgement is not part of how Spartan society organised its relationship to women's work. The work is expected. Expected things are not acknowledged. They are simply noted when they are absent. Your husband, when he is present, does not manage the estate. This is not a failure of initiative on his part. It is the structure of Spartan life, which had made a very deliberate decision about where male citizens' attention should be directed. The military mess, the training, the duties of citizenship, the relationships of military brotherhood that were the foundation of Spartan fighting effectiveness. These consumed him when he was in Sparta, and campaign consumed him when he was not. The estate was your domain in the functional sense that mattered. He brought the legal and social standing, you brought the management. The arrangement worked because both parts were consistently provided. There is a quality to the authority that comes from this that is different from the authority that comes from being granted power over something. You did not have authority over the estate granted to you in the way that a title is granted. You had authority in the way that competence always produces it, by consistently doing the thing better than anyone else was doing it, over a long enough period that the competence and the role had become synonymous in the minds of everyone who dealt with you in that capacity. The helots knew who to come to with problems. The neighbouring landowners knew who to speak with about water rights and boundary disputes. The merchants who came to buy olive oil knew who to negotiate with. You were the authority because you were the authority. The social structure confirmed it, but the social structure confirmed something that was already true. Afternoon brings the textile work, and with it a different kind of attention. The cloth that Spartan households produced was functional, not decorative. Sparta did not weave the elaborate patterned fabrics that wealthy Athenian women produced as demonstrations of their skill and their confinement. Spartan cloth was made for use, for the cloaks that the soldiers wore, for the garments of the household, for the practical materials of a practical life. The work of making it was skilled work in the way that all work requiring sustained physical precision is skilled work. Your hands know the rhythm of it in the way your feet knew the rhythm of the running track, not through enjoyment or aesthetic engagement, but through repetition until the knowledge moved from your mind into your hands and lived there independently. You work alongside the helot women who assist with the textile production, and the working alongside is a very particular kind of social situation. You're in close physical proximity to people whose situation is entirely unlike yours. You can observe their faces, can overhear their conversations when they forget or stop caring that you are present, can see the small human things that the institution of helotry was designed to render invisible, because invisible people are easier to maintain in a degraded position than people who are visible and specific. The woman across from you has a daughter who is approximately the same age as your own daughter. You know this because proximity produces knowledge that hierarchy is not always able to prevent. What you do with that knowledge is a question that Sparta did not provide you with an official answer to, because the question implied a kind of recognition that was not part of the official structure. You work. The work continues. The cloth takes shape beneath your hands. The afternoon moves toward evening with the particular slowness of productive work that requires steady, sustained attention. Time that feels full rather than time that feels long. The evening accounting is where the day resolves into information. You're not doing this in writing, necessarily. The question of how literate Spartan women were is one that scholars debate because the evidence is thin, and the literacy itself was not the kind of thing that needed to be demonstrated in the surviving record. But the accounting happens regardless of whether it is written or maintained in the organised inventory of a practiced memory. What came in today? What went out? Where the shortfall is and where the surplus is, and what the gap between them means for the decisions you will make tomorrow. There is a dispute that needs attention tomorrow, a boundary question with the neighbouring estate that has been allowed to drift for too long and is now at the point where drifting further will allow it to become a significant problem. The boundary dispute is the kind of civic management that in many Greek cities would have required male representation, a husband or male relative to present the case. In Sparta, you present your own case. This is not technically unusual. Spartan women were known to handle their own legal affairs in a way that their Athenian counterparts could not. The capability is real. The system permits it. You will handle it directly, clearly, with the evidence you have assembled about the boundary's historical position and the arguments you have worked out for why the current encroachment is not a legitimate use of disputed land. Your daughter is watching you work through this in the lamplit evening. She's not doing this, obviously, not with the focused attention of someone who has decided to observe. She's doing it with the ambient attention of a child who is in the room while an adult is doing something interesting, the kind of watching that is really just being in the same space with competence and absorbing it through proximity. You were watched this way once. By women who knew how to manage estates and run dispute procedures and speak directly to powerful men without adjusting the content of what they said to accommodate the men's comfort. You absorbed what they knew through exactly this kind of proximity. Your daughter will absorb what you know the same way. There are things about this life that you appreciate in ways that you do not say out loud, because Sparta did not particularly encourage the verbal appreciation of one's own circumstances. You appreciate the directness, the specific relief of living in a culture that expects you to say what you mean and does not require you to spend enormous energy on the performance of deference and uncertainty. In Athens, a respectable woman who had something to say in the presence of men she did not know personally would have been expected to find some indirect way to say it, or not to say it at all. You cannot imagine this. You cannot imagine organising your speech around the goal of not sounding like you know things. You know things. You say what you know. The knowing and the saying are connected in a way that you have always assumed was simply how people functioned, and it has taken occasional exposure to the assumptions of visitors from other cities to remind you that this is actually specific to where you live. You appreciate the outdoor life, the fact that your movement is not restricted to the interior of a house, that you walk the estate and attend the festivals and conduct your business in the world rather than in a designated female space inside a building. Your body was trained for the outdoors, for the physical demands of movement in open terrain, and it continues to expect those demands and to be satisfied when they are met. The physical confidence that came from years of training has not diminished in the years since the training formally ended. Your body still knows what it knows. The festivals, which continue to be a part of your life as an adult woman, carry a different significance now than they did in childhood. You still participate. The choral singing and dancing that were part of your religious education remain part of the religious life of the community, and the community expects its women to participate in these as it always has. But now you also watch the younger girls, the ones in the middle of the training that you have already passed through, and you see in them the early stages of something you know the end of. The uncertainty that is still there in their movements, the effort that is still visible where yours has become invisible, the distance between where they are and where they will be. You were once where they are, they will be where you are. The continuity of this is its own kind of satisfaction. There is a woman in the neighbouring household whose husband died on a campaign 3 years ago. She continues to manage her estate, continues to appear at the festivals, continues to conduct her business with the same direct authority that she carried when her husband was alive. The standing of a Spartan widow was not nothing. It was not the precarious position that widowhood created in other Greek cities, where a woman without a husband was almost immediately required to find another male guardian to represent her legally and socially. A Spartan widow was still a Spartan woman. She still had her training, her capability, her land, her standing in the community. She was still the authority in her own domain. What she had lost was real. What remained was also real, and it was not inconsiderable. You think about this occasionally, not with morbid intention, but with the practical attention that Spartan life encouraged toward all realities, including the uncomfortable ones. Your husband might not come back. Campaigns were dangerous, and the Persian threat had not fully passed, and the political relationships between Greek cities were complicated enough that future military engagement was a reasonable expectation rather than a catastrophic surprise. If he did not come back, you would continue, the estate would continue, your children would continue. The training had built something in you that did not require his presence to function, and the estate had been primarily your domain all along, and his absence in that final, permanent way would be a grief rather than a dependency. The distinction matters. You have been shaped into someone who can hold both things, the grief and the continuation. There are things about this life that are simply hard, and Spartan culture was not interested in pretending otherwise. The isolation from your husband during the years of his most intensive military obligation was not a sacrifice that went unfelt. The specific loneliness of managing a complex operation without the kind of partnership that is available when both people are present and engaged, the particular quality of sleep in a house that someone else should be in, these things were real. The cultural expectation that you would manage them with composure did not make them easier. It just made them invisible to everyone outside your own experience. The helot women who worked in your household had their own version of this, and the version was worse in most of the ways that matter. Their husbands and sons were also subject to the risks of the male environment, the crypteers targeting, the economic precarity, the ever-present threat of collective punishment for collective resistance. Their capacity to manage these realities was not supported by Spartan cultural frameworks that praised them for their endurance. Their endurance was simply expected, as their labour was expected, as everything about them was expected, without the validation that the Spartan citizen class gave each other for exactly the same quality of persistence under pressure. You notice this. You have always noticed it. What you do with the noticing is the question that Sparta did not give you a framework for answering, because the question implied a kind of equality that the framework explicitly rejected. So the noticing sits in you, alongside everything else that Sparta requires you to carry without discussing, and you work, and the work continues, and the days go forward whether or not the larger questions are ever resolved. This is how it works, not through formal instruction, not through written curriculum, but through the lived example of competence demonstrated in real situations over real time. The knowledge that lives in the body and the memory rather than on any page, passing from one generation to the next in the specific way that practical wisdom passes when the women who hold it are present and visible and engaged in the world rather than removed from it into the interior of a house where their children cannot see them work. This is what Sparta gave its women that was genuinely valuable and genuinely unusual. Not the romance of the running track, and not the simplicity of the famous anecdotes. The daily engagement with real work in a real world, the kind of engagement that produces real knowledge and real authority, and then the visibility that allowed that knowledge to pass forward into the next generation without being interrupted by the walls of a room designed to contain it. The city of Sparta presented itself to the ancient world with a clarity that bordered on performance. Everything about Sparta was supposed to be legible, simple, and direct. The value. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The values were discipline, endurance, courage, and sacrifice. The lifestyle was austere. The food was bad on purpose. The soldiers were formidable because they had been trained from childhood to be nothing else. The women were strong and outspoken because the city needed them to be. Everything had a reason, and the reason was always the same reason. The strength of the city, the survival of Sparta, the perpetuation of the Spartan way, which was the way of hardship embraced so thoroughly that it stopped feeling like hardship and started feeling like identity. This image was enormously influential. It shaped how the Greeks thought about themselves and each other. It shaped how later Romans thought about virtue and discipline. It shaped how Enlightenment philosophers thought about civic virtue and martial culture. It shapes how the modern world imagines warriors and their values when it reaches for an ancient example to cite. 300, Thermopylae, the Wall of Spears, the brief inscription at the hot gates that tells the visitor only that you came from Sparta, and you obeyed, and you died. The image is real in some important ways. The austerity was genuine, at least for Spartan citizens. The military training was brutal and thorough. The women did have more freedom and physical capability than their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. The laconic speech for which Spartans were famous was a real cultural value, the preference for saying the necessary thing in the fewest words rather than the impressive thing in many more. These are not inventions. They are documented features of a documented society. But the image leaves things out, and what it leaves out is, as is so often the case in history, the people who made it possible. The Spartan citizen population, the people who enjoyed the freedoms and endured the training and ran the estates and fought the battles and spoke the famous compressed sentences, was a small minority of the population living in Laconia. They called themselves the homoioi, which meant something like equals, or the similar ones, a name that emphasized their internal equality with each other and their shared membership in the Spartan civic body. They owned land. They contributed to the military messes. Their sons went through the agoj. Their daughters were trained in the Spartan way. They were, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkably internally egalitarian group. The key word is internally. The helots were the people upon whose labour the entire Spartan system depended. They were not quite slaves in the technical legal sense that Roman slaves were property. They were something closer to a conquered and subjugated agricultural population tied to the land rather than to individual owners, working the fields that generated the surplus that fed the Spartan military messes, that freed the Spartan men from agricultural labour, so they could spend all their time training for war. The helots were what made the famous Spartan lifestyle possible. Without them, there was no austerity as a choice, there was just poverty. Without them, there was no freedom to train, because the training required not doing the farming, and the farming had to be done by someone. The Spartan women's freedom, the thing that astonished visitors from Athens and other Greek cities, the thing that made Gorgo's directness possible, the thing that allowed Spartan women to manage estates and express opinions and train their bodies in public, was built on exactly the same foundation. It was the helots who worked the land that Spartan women managed. It was helot labour that generated the surplus that gave Spartan households their economic basis. The woman managing the estate was managing an operation that ran on the forced labour of a subjugated population, and the freedom she exercised in doing so was enabled by that subjugation as directly as the freedom of the male citizen soldier was enabled by it. This is the gap between the image and the reality. Not that Spartan women's freedom was false, it was real. But it was not freestanding. It was constructed on top of a system of domination so thorough, so institutionalized, and so casually brutal that even Thucydides, who was not a sentimental historian, noted that most of Spartan foreign and domestic policy could be explained by one thing: the fear of the helots, the constant gnawing, never-resolved fear that the people upon whose labour everything depended would one day decide they had nothing further to lose. The crypteia, the institution through which young Spartan men killed helots as part of their military initiation, was not a fringe practice or an aberration. It was policy, it was deliberate. It was how the Spartan state maintained its psychological grip on a population that vastly outnumbered it. The helots were subjected to ritual humiliations during certain festivals, forced into performances of degradation that were designed to reinforce their position in the social order, to make them see themselves as the Spartan state needed them to see themselves. This was not incidental to Spartan society, it was structural. And the women who managed the estates, who had the freedom to run the land and supervise the labour and make the decisions, were managing a system in which the people doing the labour had no recourse, no protection from abuse, and no path out of the position they had been born into. The oversight of helot workers was not a neutral administrative task. It was participation in a system of coercion, and the participation was real whether or not any individual woman was personally inclined toward cruelty. The historical record preserves almost nothing from the perspective of the helots themselves. This is not surprising. The historical record almost everywhere in the ancient world was produced by the people at the top of hierarchies, and the helots were at the bottom of a particularly severe one. What we know of them comes filtered through Spartan sources, through Greek observers who were generally more interested in Spartan military efficiency than in the experience of the people who made it possible, and through the occasional eruption into the historical record of helot resistance, revolt, or the consequences of their absence from the Spartan system. There were helot revolts. There was a major one in the 460s before the Common Era, in the aftermath of a devastating earthquake that killed large numbers of Spartan citizens and created a moment of vulnerability that the helots attempted to exploit. The Spartans suppressed it, as they always suppress such things, with the organised violence of a military state that had spent generations preparing for exactly this scenario. The suppression was thorough and brutal and left no permanent change in the system, which is to say that it succeeded in the way the Spartan state defined success. What is harder to see, because it was not written down, was the daily texture of helot life under the management of Spartan households. The relationship between a Spartan woman running an estate and the helots who worked it was not simple, because human relationships are not simple even when they exist within profoundly unequal power structures. There were certainly relationships of genuine familiarity, of something that in a different context might be described as mutual recognition between people who shared a physical space and worked toward common practical ends. There were certainly also relationships of fear, resentment, and the casual cruelty that comes from power exercised without accountability. Both things could be true at the same time, and in most cases probably were. The Spartan image of female freedom has had a long afterlife. It was held up by ancient writers as evidence of Spartan exceptionalism. It was admired by Enlightenment thinkers who saw in Spartan civic virtue a model for their own political projects. It has been invoked, sometimes thoughtfully and sometimes carelessly, in modern discussions about women's capacity for physical training, athletic competition, and civic participation. The Spartan woman as an archetype has meant different things to different eras, and the archetype has proven remarkably durable. The reason for that durability is worth examining. The Spartan woman offered something that most ancient cultures did not, which was the image of a woman who was strong, educated, capable of authority, and publicly visible, without those qualities being markers of her disgrace or her outsider status. In virtually every other ancient Greek context, a woman who ran things and spoke her mind and moved through the world with physical confidence was either an object of suspicion or a figure of myth, not a realistic model of how women could actually live. Sparta offered something different. Sparta said that this was normal. Sparta said that this was what women were when they were properly raised, and the rest of the Greek world found this both admirable and deeply alarming, and the combination has kept people discussing it ever since. But the admiration has often been selective. It has tended to focus on the parts of the Spartan model that are easy to celebrate without examining the parts that are not. the running track and the directness of speech and the estate management and the famous composure. These elements of the Spartan model were genuinely interesting, and the admiration for them was not misplaced in the sense that these were genuinely remarkable features of a genuinely unusual society, but they were also the parts that could be extracted from the context and admired in isolation without confronting what the context actually contained. The context contained helots. The context contained a state that declared war on its own agricultural labourers on an annual basis as a matter of administrative routine. The context contained a system of psychological and physical terror maintained over generations, consuming the political and military attention of the city, eventually consuming the city itself when the suppressed population was freed by military defeat. The context contained women whose extraordinary relative freedom was the direct and specific product of a subjugated population's labour, and who were the daily administrators of that subjugation in the domestic sphere. None of this makes the Spartan women less real, or their capabilities less genuine, but it does make the archetype more complicated than the admiring accounts tend to allow, and the complication is worth sitting with because it points towards something that is still true about the way freedom and its costs are distributed in human societies. The freedom of some people is almost always connected, in ways that require careful examination to fully understand, to the constrained circumstances of other people. This is not always as stark as the Spartan case, and it is not always as deliberately constructed, but the pattern is recognizable, and ancient Sparta is one of the places where it is most visible, which is perhaps the reason historians keep returning to it, not only to admire but to understand. But the archetype floats free of the system that produced it. It presents the freedom without the foundation. It celebrates the running and the directness and the estate management, without accounting for the helot labour that made all of it possible. It holds up Gorgo's intelligence and independence without asking who was working the fields that funded her household while she was figuring out the coded tablet. The gap between these two things, between the celebrated image of the capable Spartan woman and the brutal reality of the system that enabled her capability, is not a reason to dismiss the image. Gorgo was real. Her intelligence was real. The physical training of Spartan girls was real, and the freedoms it produced were real freedoms, relative to the alternatives available to women in that world. But real things can coexist with other real things that complicate them, and the full picture of ancient Sparta requires both. It requires the running track in the cold morning and the estate walk at dawn, and it also requires asking who woke up before the estate owner did and worked the soil that the estate walked over. It requires acknowledging that the freedom of some people was purchased at the cost of the unfreedom of others, which is not a uniquely Spartan observation, because this is true of most freedom throughout most of human history, and the places where it is most visible are the places where the gap between the image and the reality is large enough to notice. Sparta was one of those places. The image was impressive, the reality was complicated, and the people who fell through the gap between them left almost no record of themselves, because the system that defined their lives had no interest in their stories, and the people who wrote history were not among them. That is the honest account of ancient Sparta, not the monument and not the demolition of the monument, just the whole picture, as clearly as the surviving evidence allows us to see it, which is clearly enough to understand that the famous city on the Eurotas was, like all cities in all eras, built by more people than it ever acknowledged, and that what those people built was something genuinely extraordinary, sitting on a foundation that they would not have chosen for themselves. There were moments in the Spartan calendar when the gap between the official image and the underlying reality was so visible that it almost seemed deliberate, almost seemed like the city was not trying to hide the contradiction, but was instead, in some deep structural way, incapable of recognizing it as a contradiction at all. The annual declaration of war on the helots was one of those moments. At the beginning of each year, the Spartan ephors, the elected officials who held significant executive power in the Spartan dual king system, formally declared war on the helot population. This declaration was not metaphorical. It was a legal mechanism, a formal act of state, and its purpose was specific. If a Spartan killed a helot in the course of the crypteia or in any other context that the state considered warranted, the declaration meant that no pollution, no ritual contamination attached to the killer. The killing was not murder. It was an act of war, and war had different rules than murder. The declaration was therefore a legal fiction that served a real purpose. the ongoing management of a population through systematic terror, protected from the religious and social consequences that would otherwise attach to killing. This was not a secret. It was an annual public act. The Ephors did it openly. The Spartans knew it happened, the helots knew it happened, the Greeks of other cities knew it happened, because this kind of institutional arrangement did not stay confined to the city that practiced it, particularly when the city was as consequential and as scrutinized as Sparta. It was documented by Aristotle, who had significant access to the historical and political material of his era, and who included it in his discussion of Spartan institutions with the calm matter-of-factness of someone reporting a fact rather than exposing a secret. And yet it sat entirely alongside the image of Spartan virtue, the austerity and the discipline and the courage and the famous simplicity of Spartan life, without those two things seeming to the people who held both simultaneously to be in any tension with each other. The helots were not, in the Spartan accounting, part of the citizenry whose virtue was being discussed. They were part of the infrastructure. Infrastructure requires maintenance. The declaration was maintenance. The cryptia was maintenance. The systematic humiliation at festivals was maintenance. All of it was simply the ongoing operation of a system that had been running for long enough that it had stopped needing justification and had become simply the way things were. Aristotle himself had things to say about the helots. He wrote that the helots lay in wait for any disaster that might befall their masters. He was describing the political situation from the Spartan citizens' perspective, using language that placed agency and threat with the helots, rather than cause and injustice with the institution. But what he was also, inadvertently describing, was the degree to which the helots' resistance was rational, was responsive to the reality of their situation, was the predictable response of people who had been told repeatedly and at considerable cost that they were enemy populations living under occupation, and who were drawing the obvious conclusion from that repeated message. The helots were predominantly the descendants of the Messenians, the people of Messenia, the fertile western region of the Peloponnese that Sparta had conquered in a series of wars between the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era. The Messenians had not been a small or weak people before the conquest. They had been an established population with their own culture, their own agriculture, their own identity. The conquest had been brutal, the subjugation had been thorough, and the memory of what Messenia had been before Sparta owned it was preserved in the helot population with the persistence that dispossessed peoples tend to preserve the memory of what they lost. There were Messenian revolts. The Second Messenian War, which ancient sources dated to the late 7th century before the Common Era, lasted long enough to seriously threaten the Spartan state and was suppressed only with difficulty. The revolt that followed the earthquake of 464 before the Common Era lasted a decade and required the intervention of Athenian forces before it was finally put down, a piece of history that contributed to the deteriorating relationship between Sparta and Athens that would eventually produce the Peloponnesian War. The helots were not passive, they were not resigned, they were a subjugated population with a functioning sense of their own historical identity and their own claim to the land they worked, and they acted on that identity whenever the conditions allowed. The Spartan response to each revolt was to suppress it, and to intensify the mechanisms of control, not to reconsider the system, not to ask whether a different arrangement might be more stable, but to double down on the instruments that had produced the revolts in the first place. This is not unusual in the history of systems that depend on coercion. The people who benefit from such systems tend to respond to their instability by reinforcing them rather than reforming them, because reform would require acknowledging that the foundation was wrong, and acknowledging the foundation's wrongness would require rethinking everything that was built on it. This is a kind of intellectual and moral failure that is also, unfortunately, a very human one. The Spartans were human, and they made it. The women who managed the estates were part of this system in the specific way that the daily management of helot labour made them part of it. They were not the dramatic enforcers, not the cryptia figures moving through the countryside in darkness. They were the quotidian face of Spartan authority, the people whom the helots on a given estate dealt with most directly and most continuously. The relationship between an estate-managing Spartan woman and the helots she managed was therefore a relationship that contained everything the system contained: the coercion, the dependency, the daily negotiation of power and compliance, and also, because human beings are incapable of sustained proximity without producing some form of recognition, something that resisted the system's clean categorizations. There are hints in the historical record of helot women who nursed Spartan children, which was a common enough arrangement across the ancient world that it almost certainly happened in Sparta as well, though the record is thin. There are references to helot household servants whose presence in the domestic space of Spartan families was continuous and intimate. There are the ordinary facts of shared physical space over extended time, the kind of proximity that produces knowledge of individuals as individuals regardless of what the system says they are. None of this made the system less brutal. All of it made it more complicated than the system's official ideology could accommodate. The helot experience of Spartan women's management was not the same as the Spartan woman's experience of it. This seems obvious, but it is worth stating clearly, because the history has preserved almost exclusively the Spartan perspective, and the Spartan perspective on its own management of the helots was not the perspective that included what it felt like to be managed. The helot who got up before dawn to work a field he did not own, who brought in a harvest of which he received a fixed proportion regardless of how good the yield was, who lived with the knowledge that a bad year for the estate was an immediate crisis for his household, while a bad year was merely a setback for the Spartan woman whose estate it technically was, that helot was living inside the same system at a completely different angle. The economic terms of helotry were not identical everywhere in Laconia. The historical record suggests that helots paid a fixed rent in kind, a proportion of the harvest, to the Spartan citizens whose land they worked. This was not a completely lawless exploitation, in the sense that there was no structure. There was structure. The problem with the structure was not that it was arbitrary, but that it was designed entirely in the interest of the party that had the weapons. The helots paid what was required. What was required was set by the people who had the weapons. If the required proportion was too high for the helot household to survive, that was a problem that the structure did not have an official mechanism for resolving. Survival was the helot's problem. The contribution was Sparta's concern. Sparta controlled the helot population through mechanisms that were primarily psychological in their daily operation, even when they were backed by physical violence. The formal declaration of war, the annual targeting season of the Crypteia, the requirement that helots wear specific clothing to distinguish them visually from citizens, the prohibition on mourning the dead in public ways that might express solidarity or collective grief. These were not ad hoc cruelties. They were designed interventions aimed at preventing the development of the internal solidarity and collective identity that might produce organized resistance. The psychological dimension of oppression, its targeting of the capacity for solidarity and shared identity, is something that the Spartan state understood with considerable sophistication, though not in those terms, because it did not theorize what it did. It simply did it and noted that it seemed to work. Until it did not. The earthquake of 464 was the kind of catastrophe that no system of psychological control can prevent. It killed perhaps 20,000 Spartan citizens, depending on the estimate, a devastating blow to a citizen population that was already smaller than the helot population by a significant margin, and that had been declining for some time due to the hereditary requirements of Spartan citizenship and the difficulty of meeting them. The earthquake exposed what the system of control had been masking. The helots were more numerous than the Spartans. They were organized enough to coordinate a revolt, and they were motivated by 2 centuries of accumulated grievance. The revolt that followed lasted a decade. The Spartan response to the decade-long revolt involved, at one point, a decision that revealed the depth of the fear. Sparta called in Athenian allies to assist with suppression. The Athenians came because they were allies, and because Sparta had requested help, and then Sparta sent the Athenians home again, mid-operation, giving as the official reason that the Athenian democratic character was unsuitable for the kind of operation underway. The real reason, as Thucydides understood and as historians since have generally accepted, was that Sparta was afraid of what the Athenians might observe or encourage in the helot population by their mere presence as representatives of a society that had a different political philosophy. The Athenians were not welcome in the suppression, because they could not be trusted to share the Spartan analysis of who counted and who did not, and this uncertainty was more dangerous than conducting the suppression with fewer troops. This decision, the dismissal of the Athenians, contributed directly to the deterioration of Spartan-Athenian relations that would produce the Peloponnesian War, which would consume the Greek world for a generation and leave both cities weakened. The fear of the helots, playing out through one specific decision, helped cause a war that helped cause the decline of both great powers of classical Greece. This is the systemic consequence of the foundation, not just the obvious moral consequence of building a civilization on the suffering of a subjugated population, but the practical political consequence, the way that maintaining the system consumed resources and attention and political capital that were not then available for other things, and the way that the inherent instability of the system kept producing crises that required responses that produced further crises. The liberation of the Messenian helots, when it finally came, was not given by Sparta. It was taken. In 369 before the Common Era, the Theban general Epaminondas invaded the Peloponnese after defeating the Spartan army at the Battle of Leuctra, the defeat that ended Sparta's era of military dominance. He restored Messenia as an independent state. The Messenians were freed not by the goodness of the system that had held them, but by its military defeat. And once freed, they built a new city, Messene, on the slopes of the mountain that had watched over their captivity, and they built it with the specific intention that it should be defensible, should be permanent, should be a statement that they were here now and were not going to be dispossessed again. Sparta declined after that. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily. The citizen population had been declining for generations under the combined pressures of military casualties and the inheritance laws that concentrated land in fewer and fewer hands. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The loss of Messenia meant the loss of the helot labour that the military lifestyle had depended on. The peculiar Spartan lifestyle, the austerity, the military messes, the training, all of it rested finally on the agricultural surplus produced by the forced labour of people who were now free. Without that surplus, the lifestyle was not sustainable in its existing form. Sparta became a smaller, quieter, different kind of place. It survived. It persists today as a small city in the Peloponnese. But the Sparta that the ancient world discussed, the famous city of the famous soldiers and the famous women and the famous bad food, that Sparta did not outlast its foundation by very long after the foundation was removed. This is the hidden reality. Not just that the system was brutal, which it was, not just that the brutality was systematic and institutional, which it was, but that the system's brutality was also its weakness. The fear that maintained the control was also the fear that consumed political attention and military resources, and eventually led to decisions that cost Sparta the military dominance it had traded everything to achieve. The gap between the image of Spartan strength and the reality of Spartan fragility was this foundation, and the foundation was always, from the beginning, the thing that was most likely to give way. The Spartan women whose freedom and capability the ancient world admired were real, and their freedom was real, and their capability was genuine. The helots whose labour made that freedom possible were also real, and their suffering was genuine, and the two things existed in the same physical space at the same time, and neither cancels the other out, and both need to be in the picture before the picture is complete. There is a thread that runs through tonight, quiet and persistent, connecting the cold mornings on a Spartan training ground to a woman reading a coded message in a Spartan palace, to another woman managing fields and disputes and grain stores in her husband's long absence, to the hidden people whose labour made all of it possible and whose names the historical record did not think were worth keeping. The thread is endurance, not the heroic kind, not the kind that gets inscribed on monuments or celebrated in the speeches that powerful people make about other powerful people. The ordinary kind, the kind that is just continuing to do what needs to be done in a system you did not design, under conditions you did not choose, with the capability you were given because the system needed you to have it, and sometimes with a capability that you found along the way and decided to keep for yourself regardless of whether the system had planned for that. The girl running in the cold in the first grey of a Spartan morning was not running to be free. She was running because the city needed her to be strong, but the running made her strong, and the strength was hers in ways that went beyond what the city had intended. Gorgo, sitting in a room full of men negotiating the fate of continents, said what she thought because Sparta had raised her to say what she thought, and the saying was in service of Spartan values. But the clarity of mind that produced the right answer in that moment was also just hers. The woman walking her estate at dawn, managing the complex machinery of land and labour and obligation, was doing what the system required, but she was also doing something that no one could take from her once it was done. The work had been accomplished, the decisions had been made, the thing had been held together. And somewhere underneath all of that, the people whose labour sustained the whole operation continued their own kind of endurance, the kind that history has the most difficulty seeing, because it was not the kind that generated speeches or monuments, or famous last stands at narrow passes. It was the kind that just continued, in the dark, in the cold, in the fields, in the mornings that came one after another with no pause for acknowledgement. That is what we have looked at tonight, in all its complicated reality. A city that asked extraordinary things of the people it called its own, and built those extraordinary things on the silence of people it had decided were not its own, and produced in the process a story so compelling that it outlasted the city by 2,000 years and is still being told in forms the Spartans would not have recognized. The story is real, the complexity is also real, and the people in it, the girl on the running track, the queen in the palace, the woman in the fields, the helot in the dark, all of them were real people doing real things in a real world that had been arranged around them before they arrived and would continue after they were gone. The night has been long enough. The history has been dense enough and full enough and alive enough with the specific texture of lives that were nothing like yours, and also, in the ways that matter most, exactly like yours. People navigating systems, people enduring conditions, people finding the edges of the freedom they had been given, and occasionally stepping past those edges because they could, and because no one was watching, and because the capability was there and it wanted to be used. Let that settle now. Let the running track go quiet and the palace lamps go out and the estate fall into the stillness of a Spartan night, with the Taygetos mountains dark against the stars and the Eurytas making its soft sound over stones that are still there if you go to look for them, the same stones, in roughly the same river, in roughly the same valley, 2,500 years later. Some things persist, not the empire, not the system, not the brutal arithmetic of the cryptire or the forced labour of the helots, but the valley, the mountains, the river. And something else, harder to name, the dim surviving evidence that people were here, that they got up in the cold and ran and argued and managed and endured and occasionally said exactly the right thing in exactly the right room at exactly the right moment, and then they rested. You can rest now too. The night is doing what it's supposed to do, which is nothing. No assessment is required. No decisions need to be made. The estate is quiet and the training ground is empty, and the long day has reached the place where it releases you from its claims. Sleep well. You have been to Sparta and back, and that is enough for any night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.